Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So then, Matt, who are we talking to in this episode?
Hi, Liam. Yeah, we've got in this episode André Carrington, Associate Professor of Literature at the University of California, Riverside, and author of the 2016 book Speculative Blackness, The Future of Race in Science Fiction, and editor of the collection of short fiction, The Black Fantastic, which came out earlier this year and features stories from a host of wonderful contemporary Black speculative fiction writers. I'll give you a little bit of a summary, I suppose, of the interview. In a way, we were picking up from where we left off, I suppose, with our interview with Jordan Carroll. So, if you're interested in this episode and you haven't yet checked that out, I think you'll find some useful ideas there. So we started out by discussing the dual role of the fan and the critic, which is again something that Jordan and I had spoken about in the previous episode. That I think as an academic myself, and I think a lot of our listeners are probably academics or academic adjacent in some capacity, we do occupy that sort of position often, or we find ourselves occupying that position of kind of fan and critic at the same time. Andre spoke of the differences he found with the way race was being treated in sort of fan communities as opposed to academic communities, which I thought was really interesting. Generally, I mean, across the interview as a whole, Andre referred to a large number of texts and critics that certainly open the door to reading or different ways of reading the history of speculative fiction, or that give that kind of history a new emphasis, which I thought was really useful for listeners as well, and for me. I certainly learned a lot in the interview. Andre spoke about the impact of Black speculative fiction in the last decade as well. So he talks about it as a kind of the last decade is a kind of time of excitement, I think, in this maybe subgenre, if we want to call it that. So since he published his book Speculative Blackness in 2016, we've really seen an explosion of Black voices making their mark on the genre. And he sort of talks about that in relation to sort of the audience demand for these stories, which has been generally demonstrated by the success of several prominent authors like Octavia E. Butler and Samuel Delany, for example, who have drawn quite a lot of attention and recognition, certainly in academic fields. But we also discussed Andre's efforts to highlight the work of other lesser known writers who have also helped shape that field and continue to shape it now. We talked a bit more about as well his work in putting together that Black Fantastic collection, which is in part about giving these writers a platform, but also I think a kind of project to help define that genre. Continuing the interview, we discussed things like the history of Black speculative fiction and the way in which Black writers have always, often by necessity, challenged the conventions of the genre in which they've written in. So to some extent, when we think back about the history of speculative fiction, we might need to rewrite that history in some ways to understand it better, to more properly acknowledge the involvement of Black writers who are coming at it often from a wider set of literary backgrounds. And then, as the interview sort of drew to a close, Andre spoke about the importance of speculative fiction for the ability of Black people to imagine, articulate, and construct visions of the future. And of course, we finished by further adding to my lengthy to be read list, which is now becoming obscene. So yeah, he gave loads of suggestions, great suggestions on who to go and read next. That was my kind of summary or breakdown of the interview. What did you make of it, Liam?
Yeah, I thought it was again another really, really interesting one, and one that for me was quite eye-opening. Something that I felt like I quite learned a lot from. I think Andre makes the point relatively early in the interview when talking about race and sort of fandom and the academy and scholarship that often sort of Black scholars and Black voices have to consider race and have to bring race to the table, where maybe scholars like you and I who are white do not, because it doesn't factor into our thinking necessarily. And again, I think this general eye-opening for me made me think back to the interview with Jordan, and there was some interesting mirroring in sort of turns of phrase between both Jordan and Andre about who gets to imagine the future, and by imagining the future, what do those futures look like, and who is empowered and who is disempowered through the act of imagining. And again, I thought that was it's just been a sort of reoccurring thread across these two episodes that I think is something I want to go away and think more about. I was really pleased and interested to see that Andre, when he talks about literature, he doesn't just mean capital L literature or books. He means a whole host of forms of text. He's an avid sort of comic reader, I gather, and a comic scholar. But also spoke a lot about film and television and things like that too. And he mentioned a film that I really love being Black Panther. Love the movie, one of my favorite of the Marvel sort of films. As that being part of a really significant burst, as you mentioned, of sort of Black speculative fiction and sort of very Black-centered speculative fiction, which again I think is great. And I was saying to you just earlier off recording that maybe tied into that boom almost is the work of Jordan Peele, director of Get Out, Us, Nope, which again is a sort of another sort of area of speculative, but maybe more on like the horror sort of area, but still speculative all the same. That I think maybe is characteristic of this explosion that Andre was talking about. So that's some of the things that really struck out to me this time. What about you, Matt? What else sort of has this sparked for you?
Yeah, I mean, I also a big fan of Jordan Peele's work. I've actually only earlier today, in fact, I was watching a student presentation on Get Out, and I suppose that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it's crossed over into the academy particularly effectively, and that's one of the things that we were talking about in the interview. How has the academy, if you like, been a kind of offered a platform for a lot of these writers that maybe mainstream publishing hasn't always done, and how is that maybe a route into mainstream publishing in various types. And that's not me as an academic trying to take credit for that at all, because of course we just teach the things that we're interested in, the things that we love, and I think that's that dynamic between fan and critic that's really interesting. But it is interesting to ponder how the role of the academy in this and its important role. But yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Jordan Peele's work, and as you say, I think his popularity is again another one of those kind of Octavia Butler moments where he demonstrated that there was this market there. And of course, the industry responds to that market. So that is by default important work. But I think that's the important thing here, is that it's as much as anything about discovery. So the quality of the material we're talking about kind of does the work for you. It speaks for itself. I kind of come back to what Andre was saying as well about this sense that Black writers have often had to write in a slightly different way, not to get noticed necessarily, but because their circumstances are often different, their contexts are different, and that means that they often break through boundaries, taboos. I'm thinking about Toni Morrison, for example, as well. And so in that sense, they are inherently interesting. Their texts, they're often interesting. So yeah, I mean, just talking recently, I think that the most interesting text I've read by a black writer recently was Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All Stars, and he has a short story in the Black Fantastics, so that's a reason to check it out. But if you haven't read that novel, I mean, it's great. It's like the Hunger Games, but better in my opinion. It's like a sophisticated. I'm not saying the Hunger Games is not sophisticated, but it's kind of just a more interesting, more thought-provoking version where it's not about kind of YA stuff. It's more about the ideas behind that. And I also recently read his collection of short stories, Friday Black, which also has some really interesting, thought-provoking short pieces of spec fic. So I'd really recommend his work if you kind of, maybe if you've read Parable the Sower, Parable of the Talents, you like that kind of stuff, and you want a bit more of that kind of material that's really interesting. I think his work's great, and he's I think going to be a leading figure in the years to come.
Yeah, Chain Gang All Stars was something I read last year on holiday. It was a holiday read for me, just before my Viva, so like a much needed sort of rest time for me. And yeah, it was so captivating and central to the premise of that text is incarceration in essence, right? And the sort of racial injustices sort of that are entangled into that, certainly in the US. And I think it's a phenomenal piece of speculative fiction. Yeah, absolutely stunning. Something that you said earlier in your summation again, Matt, reminded me of something you and Andre were discussing, which is that there's a lot of barriers that Black authors face in the publishing industry. And again, going back to like the who gets to imagine the future, who gets to write about the future. But I think you both spoke about the importance of having these texts on the curriculum. And by no means do I think either of you were saying that necessarily legitimizes these texts, because they're legitimate on their own terms. So that's not what you guys were saying. But you were talking about how, people studying literature in whatever capacity, at colleges, at universities, at higher education institutions, they're the people who love literature and really switched on to literature. And something that I thought you guys were going to mention and then maybe didn't, and it's either because that's just not where the conversation went or because it's not what you're thinking. But in my mind, I was sort of there, sort of wondering if by featuring these texts on our modules, on our curricula, because they're just excellent texts anyway, no matter what those sort of publishing trends are saying or whatever, the English lit students of today are the publishers, the publicists, the booksellers, the etc., 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 the policy shapers, the I don't know, the arts festival curators, and so on of tomorrow. And so I don't know what you think. So this basically is: do you think that by platforming these brilliant texts by people whose voices have been maybe historically suppressed or undermined or dismissed, do you, maybe in a slightly utopian move, do you think that allows for a future in which that doesn't happen to occur? Like, does that make that more possible? Sorry,
I
it's a big
suppose
question, isn't it?
no. I know. It's a good question, and I think it's a good observation. My really flippant and cynical answer was going to be, it depends on if they're programming the AI or not. The short answer should be yes. In a world that proceeds as I think we would hope it would. With these people going on to get jobs in that industry. Absolutely. But as I said, my sort of cynical turn is, depends on who's programming the AI. And that's one of the kind of dangers of the future. But I mean, there is also like I suppose a positive thing that I don't think, again, we didn't really talk much about in the interview, which is that a lot of this is made possible as well by the availability of a lot of this material online. So obviously the downside of that is that a lot of these figures today are not getting properly paid as they should for the quality of their creative work. But another possibility is it is more democratic in that there is more free stuff available online, and more people can write, and people can publish in a way, albeit without the kind of monetary return, in a much freer environment than they were able to, 50, 100 years ago, when you had to go through those mainstream publishers, or no one would ever read your stuff. I'm just thinking now, we could go and recommend something like Octavia Butler's Bloodchild, 20-page short story, which you can find online. And and that's such a great introduction to this kind of writing. And you could go, well, okay, it's really provocative, that short story. I don't know if you've read it, but it's sort of like, this is the kind of thing you can just drop on students and go, right, okay, have fun with that. It will get them talking. And it's as I say, it's short, it's 20 pages, it's online, you can get hold of it. So that's of real benefit, I think.
Well, Matt, I think we've teased the contents of the interview quite enough now. So how about we pass over to yourself, and maybe more importantly, over to Andre as well.
Roll the tape. I'm delighted to have with me André Carrington. And Andre, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience, please?
Sure. I'm Andre. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and I direct the program in speculative fictions and cultures of science here.
And you've also written quite substantially in that area. Might you talk about your publications a little bit?
Yeah. I wrote a book called Speculative Blackness, The Future of Race in Science Fiction, that came out in 2016. And it's about blackness in science fiction and fantasy media writ large, and also about fan cultures and what the audience has meant to shaping our ideas of race and genre in American popular culture. And I recently edited an anthology of contemporary Black speculative fiction called The Black Fantastic, 20 Afrofuturist Stories, which is what it says, and is all mostly from the past 10 years, Black writers from the US and diaspora in science fiction, fantasy, horror, some other supernatural and spooky stuff. And I've written a fair amount about comics and queer studies, usually together, and a little bit of other stuff about African American literature and culture.
That sounds really interesting. I mean, I will come back to some of that later work as we go on, but I wanted to start with that book of yours, Speculative Blackness. And you already mentioned this in your description of it, but I having read the opening, I particularly noticed this exploration of the idea that you are both kind of a fan and a critic at the same time. And I kind of thought that was particularly interesting. How do you find that you negotiate between these roles when you're writing about texts, and maybe even when you're sort of consuming them as well?
Yeah, that approach came out of reading kind of the first studies of fandom and participatory culture that were published in the late 80s and 90s, like Henry Jenkins and Camille Bacon Smith, and other scholars in that moment. And it was really fascinating to me that by drawing on what fans had to say and what fans made out of popular culture, that critics in that moment were able to really get at aspects of, especially aspects of science fiction and fantasy, aspects of television, and also of publishing and writing and creativity that we don't see aired as much, and we don't see in, or we hadn't seen in academic study up until then. And in the couple of decades between when they did that work and when I was in graduate school, there have been more more scholarship by fans, more people who were science fiction fans and media fans becoming critics, professionally and academically, kind of in the the burgeoning social media space and the online space, and also in academic circles, really contributing to reception and audience studies. And for me, entering that space, I recognized that there was not much critical attention to race, and there was, especially for all of the attention to gender and sexuality, which was really productive in those areas, the ways that fan scholarship made a lot more room for women as fans and women as critics and as critical thinkers in addition to consumers. There was not a very intersectional perspective in that space. There was not a space that took seriously how strongly desire and attractiveness and even like antipathy and hate and trolling and things were driven as much by gender and sexuality as they were by race and racism. And I knew from the way that African American literary criticism has been attentive to race and culture, and the way that Black fans and Black members of the media audience are attentive to racism as an issue affecting both our opportunities and the way we consume media, that there was a lot of room for different arguments to be made, and also for different histories of like how representations at different moments went over with different segments of the public. That there was room for those things to be spoken to. Rebecca Wanzo was the person who really opened that avenue for a lot of critics like me, and perspectives like hers really showed that there was room to say, okay, what do we as Black audience members, as critics, as fans, as consumers, what do we have to say about these undoubtedly formative media images that are often, spaces of fantasy and adventure and excitement, but that are shaped by the very real politics of race and culture that we live with.
So would you say that's kind of coming at it from like a critical angle, or would you say it's coming at it first and foremost from, the fans' perspective of trying to hold up things that you love, or kind of, do you see what I mean, or trying to sort of criticize those things that may be putting out messages that are problematic in some way, or maybe unintentionally so at times?
It's very much a kind of oscillating between those two places that for I think a big difference in how we consume culture is driven by class and driven by education, but the way that Black folks relate to things like educational attainment and even things like uh, vocabulary and sort of space to enunciate criticism, in writing or in a more vernacular and everyday way, even saying that, the way we consume popular culture is shaped by class and education, even that itself has to do with race and, social stratification and stuff. So I come to the media images that I find compelling and that I find challenging and problematic, and the questions I want to raise about them, always with an interest in kind of a question of why do we care as critics, and why do we care as audience members, and why does this imagery matter to us, and what gets done with images of Blackness, whether they're authored by Black folks or not, matters a lot to Black audience members like myself. And that question of why we care is as much a way to explain and celebrate why we love certain images like Storm in the X-Men or like Uhura in the original Star Trek, that those are fascinating, beloved images and narratives that different creators have brought to life. But they're also sites where a lot of arguments that are important to people that don't always get handled well in popular culture play out. So that question of why we care is as much a fan question as a critic question. It's a question of, what do we love about this? And also, why is it problematic, or why is it important to take, different imagery to task when it's misunderstood? And also, why is it significant to notice when Black folks take up or take an interest in images that might not have been created for us, but become meaningful to us?
Yeah, I feel maybe it's like a part of a slightly privileged position, that I'm not having to sort of think about that when I'm interrogating texts. And, that's not to say I like, that's not to say I like all the texts that I study and explore and critique in my own writing. But it does feel like a kind of luxury just to focus on the things that I really like and love and hold them up. Whereas it sounds like to me that you are in some capacity, your instinct is to do that, but you also have to pay attention to those other more negative images in that space as well, which maybe means you don't have the time to dedicate always to just that holding up those texts that you really love. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
yeah, it absolutely. Yeah, it really captures how the sort of preoccupation that I think inspires a lot of readers to become critics, inspires a lot of people who love reading, people who love books to become academics, that is very much the path that fans take. That, what becomes entertainment for one person becomes kind of a lifelong source of pleasure and engagement and community for other people. And those things often work in tandem. I think that for Black audience members and Black academics and Black fans and critics, coming to any place in popular culture, whether those spaces are the ones that we have invented ourselves, or they're spaces where we've kind of carved out a niche or found a sense of belonging on the margins, that engagement is very similar. That's driven by both a lot of interest and potential for gratification, but it's also driven by conflict and thorny questions um, and demands that we place on art and on culture to speak to our interests and our desires. And those demands aren't always satisfied for anybody.
Mm. And just to return to the book itself, you write that placing Blackness, and I'm quoting you here, at the center of discussions about speculative fiction augments our understanding of what the genre might be and what it might do. And I kind of, felt reading this opening that the project itself maybe is a kind of form of speculation as well, about the future of science fiction. You published the book back in 2016. I just wondered what you saw then as the kind of genre's potential, and maybe what the general direction of travel has been like since then. I mean, we're almost a decade way out from that now, so.
Um, it has been a really fascinating decade. Taking stock of the fact that it's been that long since 2016 is kind of jarring, but in that span of time, I think some things that have happened that have spoken to, I hope, the relevance of what I was saying, the questions I was raising then are, terms like Afrofuturism and Black Fantastic have become even more widely legible than they were, say, in the 2000s when people like Alondra Nelson and Natasha Womack brought those terms into circulation. And I think the way that people see opportunities in popular media for Black folks to participate in different kinds of storytelling have exploded. There was, the big breakthrough moment of Ryan Coogler's Black Panther movie, the way that we were able to have a brief time with kind of an iconic actor like Chadwick Boseman, to see him in a role like that. That was in some ways a very genre-defying role, the superhero character in a big tentpole studio movie, was very much at the center, was a sort of a rare moment where Black folks are at the center of something in popular culture where we hadn't been before. But at the same time, seeing that there are spaces where we might want to see Black folks have a chance, have an opportunity, and seeing those opportunities pan out, seeing them fulfilled with things like I'm thinking of people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Roxane Gay writing comic books, seeing more success and more critical acclaim, very well deserved, for writers like N.K. Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor in the past few years. There has just been, I think, a appreciation for the work that people do and opportunities that people have taken. And when you see people get opportunities and run with them, the way that the audience responds, I think, is something that I was interested in drawing our attention to with what I was saying in my book, that sometimes seeing an image of Black folks in a way that we hadn't seen before through something like fantasy and science fiction, through something that might be detached from this kind of realist storytelling that we're accustomed to, and even the sort of foreclosed and limited horizons of stories about Black people that we're accustomed to. Seeing storytelling that challenges those limitations and that breaks through them and showcases a full range of talents that people have to bring to them, that I think has shown itself in, a consistent demand that people show up for stories like that and people get excited for them.
Yeah, I think you make a real effort to sort of be part of that yourself. I think in the book, I mean, you're trying to explore writers that are perhaps less familiar to people. So it's not just those big names that are kind of, absorbing all that attention. You're sort of giving platforms for new voices to emerge, and those might not be new people, but revisiting, older writers who perhaps, have been forgotten or whatever. I know for a start in the book, you mentioned that you intentionally stayed away from Samuel Delany and Octavia Butler, for example. And was it just that there was just loads that had been written on those authors already, and so that you just felt like you didn't need to say anything about them? Or is there a sense, do you think, that their success sometimes can be unhelpful because people who are maybe outside that genre or unfamiliar with it just gravitate towards those big names, and I would include myself in that category as someone who perhaps is ignorant to a lot of these kind of writers out there and ends up attracted toward the sort of Octavia Butlers and the Delaney's.
Yeah, that was kind of my motivation, was sort of working around and trying to kind of build on the recognizability of a few authors who have had attention and have also had academic attention given to their work. I thought these are really good touchstones. These are really good pillars to build on, but their recognizability is in a way a point of entry into, what's going on more broadly and what's going on in spaces outside of conventional literature, but also genre fiction, the way it's traditionally defined in the marketplace and in its history. I thought, can I look to recognizable narratives that people know, like Star Trek and like the X-Men comics, and really trade on kind of how formative those spaces in culture are, in ways that I could give the same weight to that I think in the discipline of English, in disciplines like English, and even in the discipline of like African American studies and American studies, we're prepared to say literature reflects how culture works, and literature is the place where we work out political and social questions and intellectual and philosophical questions. We're totally prepared to do that with capital L literature, and we're prepared to do it with authors whose names people would know if they study literature and if they read a lot of books. But looking to, television and comic books and fan cultures, I was trying to kind of do the same with what has happened in those spaces and what's been influential in those spaces. And to the extent that I was successful with that approach, it was a way to speak to the everyday way that the public in general encounters what the genres of science fiction and fantasy look like. We encounter them as much as people who appreciate literature and recognize what makes good literature good, and even what makes intellectually sophisticated literature worthy of academic attention. But we're also very much constantly inhabiting a marketplace where many more aspects of our identities and many more of our like consumer decisions and interests as people who look to contemporary culture to tell us who we are and to reflect who we say we are. I wanted to give a lot of attention to those spaces.
Is that a kind of ongoing project? I mean, it seems like, in putting together this more recent collection, the Black Fantastic, which was, I think, was out recently, earlier this year, in fact. You're kind of contributing to the genre in a way. You know, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm assuming you're not a creative writer yourself. I
I'm
don't know.
not.
No.
I'm not.
But so is this kind of like your way of maybe participating in that? So you're, giving other people platforms to, because it's slightly, I mean, from my perspective as a writer, as an academic, it feels quite different to write a piece of kind of critical material to putting together a collection of creative works in this way. So was that part of that kind of broader project, if you like, to address some of those concerns of the earlier book by giving platforms to less heralded writers?
Yeah, it is absolutely that. Part of it is not even giving the platform, but really sharing the platform, kind of inhabiting, I think, what's often a very conventional role for critics when it comes to science fiction and fantasy has been that the criticism comes out of avid readers and well-regarded writers, or writers who have something incisive to say, or commentary that comes from fans who are themselves also contributing to, here is the lane in which certain writers operate, and fans step into that and say, yes, I love seeing this kind of thing, or I hate to see it when this doesn't go over well. And occupying that space as a critic allowed me to kind of share the platform that I have as an academic, as a certain kind of professional who makes work visible and legible to people like me, but also to people who will take seriously, you know, Library of America, a publisher that pulls together notable literature from the past, typically, when they are taking stock of what is currently going on or what is recent, to say, okay, this is a reflection of people's tastes, of what people read, and also a reflection of what some people who are not the same as those people who are reading widely, or those people who are reading what's typical or what's representative. Sometimes there are little pockets that certain readers might have access or insight into that also shape the broad picture that that the publisher and that I wanted to provide of what this stuff is, what we mean when we say Black speculative fiction. And my way of getting at that was to say, you know, what range of writers, what grouping of writers from different outlets and at slightly different moments might give us a sufficiently nuanced picture of this, some of whom will be absolutely recognizable and it will be unsurprising to see them included, and some of whom might be surprising because you would only be attentive to them if you knew their work came out a certain year and maybe didn't see that much more from them.
Is there a sense then that, I mean, is this a kind of a process of kind of canon building in a way? Is it, I mean, I'm never quite sure how much impact as academics we have in terms of giving exposure to people and their texts. I'm a little bit skeptical about it because there are these larger arms and machinery at work.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I wonder how much of these writers, exposure to people is coming through on being in that kind of literary academic circuit, if you like, and being picked up at universities. Have you had that sense that, that they are able to grow their kind of audience organically that way, or is it really just about who's being marketed by which big publishers, do you think?
I do think that it matters for writers to see their work read in classrooms and on bookshelves that people who buy a lot of books are going to look at. And I think that's I don't think that it's make or break for a lot of writers, but in my experience, talking to writers I've gotten to know a little bit through a process like editing this anthology and over the years and getting in touch with local bookstores and being a person who reads a lot and decides, what I'm going to teach in a given year, sometimes with an eye to what's new or what I haven't read or what I read and enjoyed and want to share. The college classroom doesn't always provide a marketplace or even a platform for publicity, but it does kind of, I do think that it cultivates a sort of long-term perspective that's really valuable in that the people who bring a lot of new books to our attention are people who are paying a lot of attention to and committing on a certain level to like what kind of writing is good to read, is satisfying, is exciting, is representative of something cool that's going on or something they hadn't seen before. And to the extent that academics are a part of that club, that is absolutely a role that we should acknowledge we play, right? That if we teach a book in our classes, in a way, if it's something current, we're saying like, hey, this is what's current to me. We're always a year or two behind. But being able to say, oh yeah, I noticed this happening and I'm at, the top of the educational attainment uh, part of the distribution of who's reading what. But I'm also aware that everybody, above a high school reading level, or maybe even everybody who's a college educated reader, will notice that some of the most cool, sophisticated things that we work very hard to explain in academic writing, so many of those things are modeled by working writers with all kinds of educational backgrounds and all kinds of paths to publishing what they do. And when we notice that, I think we're more aware, we're better at what we do as critics when we really access, who is doing the thing that we say is exciting and makes us love reading.
I think I'm going to take away this idea that I'm somehow responsible for setting something that seems to be cool or
Yeah.
determining that. I think my students might disagree with you, but
Oh,
but
I know they're like, oh no, you don't represent what's cool at all. And I'm like, fair.
yeah,
But I do want to notice after it's no longer cool to say
right.
it's still important, even if it's not like cool and current anymore.
Yeah, we like, I'm going to take that away. They might, yeah, reject that, but actually, see, deep down,
Yeah,
something about our recommending something actually has made it cool for them.
yeah.
If using that term "cool," I don't know, is not seriously a sign of being uncool. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me about this new collection is that, there's a lot of contributors there, and it's obvious, I think, that there's an exciting wave at the moment of those kind of black speculative fiction writers. There was a lot of names I hadn't heard of, but certainly there were some that were familiar to me. I mean, led by figures like N.K. Jemisin, who's got a story in the collection, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who also is featured there. Are you excited about what's on the horizon for this sort of generation of writers, or are they kind of facing the same difficulties trying to break into the field that they have done in the past, do you think?
I see some writers on social media, especially, um, voicing the concerns that show that a lot of the difficulties persist. And at the same time, I see that um, the sense that it's impossible or unthinkable for a certain lane, a certain genre, a certain market to exist for Black writers, I think that is largely no longer the way people encounter the problem. Now it's just that making a living as a writer is really hard, but it's no longer that it's impossible to do or that it's unprecedented. And that I think is one of the greatest possible places to operate from. I recall that early in L.A. Banks's career, she wrote a number of Black paranormal romance novels with a vampire huntress legend was the series that I recall, I think in person at an event, she was talking about how when she was first publishing some of that work in the early thousands, publishers did not think a market existed for it and kind of couldn't recognize what they had in their hands when she turned in a manuscript. And in a lot of ways, science fiction and fantasy have been spaces where, because people are telling stories that are not necessarily realist or realistic, when you get a story that is about a kind of thing you've never seen happen or that couldn't happen in the real world anyway, it is even more unlikely to see that story come from someone who you didn't know has a career ahead of them as an author. And with how conservative, the entire commodity structure of publishing and entertainment is, people don't want to bet on, don't want to invest in things that are not already proven, things that are not a sure bet. And I think that, writers like Jewel Gomez and L.A. Banks showed that, oh my gosh, if you publish stories with Black women and vampires and vampire hunters and urban fantasy and romance and all of the and historical fiction and stuff, that there is totally a market for it when it's good. And there's a market that will show you whether it's good or not. There's a market that will show you, we love this, we want more, or we love this, but we want it to go a different direction. And people signal that by saying things about it, by acting as fans and generating commentary. So I think that sense of possibility is more open than it's ever been. And I also think that more people are encountering the challenges. And that way it's like it to me as a critic, as an academic who doesn't have to make my living doing it, I can see that writers struggle to get the uptake of their work, but I don't see the struggle to demonstrate that their work is a viable creative thing to do anymore. And I know that it was a problem in the lifetimes, in the careers of people who are successful now.
I suppose then to some extent we do have to thank Octavia Butler and for that, perhaps, that's possibly, just having seen that it's done and that there's a market for it and that popularity,
Absolutely.
that figurehead, comes through.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pattern that I think speaks to kind of the way I engaged with and didn't engage with Butler and Delaney in my first book. One of the motivations I had was sort of treating what they were able to do, which among other things was to sort of defy expectations and to act as exceptions to a rule. I was really interested in, like, why is the rule this way, right? Like, why do people expect maybe images of Black characters but not Black authors? Why do people expect fans to debate race and racism and their own attitudes, but don't expect fans to bring a knowledge of racial oppression to their analysis, because we don't expect them to be people who've experienced racism, because we don't know, or we're not checking to see who is participating in a conversation that we call fandom. To the extent that people like Delaney and Butler and Tananarive Due and Nella Hopkinson have exhibited, what it is like to be an exception to those rules, in a lot of ways, the challenges that they've encountered have demonstrated that, oh yeah, those rules are really trenchant. People don't always expect Black folks to have the same investment or have like a transformative role to play in the cultural conventions that we bring to media, to literature. And then when they show us otherwise, it's really exciting and groundbreaking, and it makes things a little easier for the next person because they don't have that same challenge.
I'm sure that you have you definitely have a much better knowledge of this area than me, and I'm just thinking about, going back, particularly maybe before Butler, there's probably a much stronger sort of history of this and development of the genre. I mean, last time out, we spoke to Jordan Carroll about his book Speculative Whiteness, and in particular, we sort of discussed the association of science fiction with whiteness, and as a predominantly white space, sometimes aggressively so in terms of maybe connections between science fiction and colonialism and white supremacist narratives. Is that sort of narrative challenged by the history of Black speculative fiction, or would you sort of actually say no? This is only a much more recent phenomenon that Black writers have managed to sort of break into this space.
I think the way that I think about it is, we have always dreamed, we have always imagined, and we have always engaged in cultural practices that really run right up against the constraints on what is possible or what is practical, right? So I think a fascinating and an undeniable thing about culture and art in the African diaspora in general, and that I see all the time when I teach African American literature without the question of genre at the forefront, is Black writers making and publishing literature in our conventional, industries and categories usually bring to those spaces and those industries usually bring um, a little more flexibility about the question of realism or something else, and about the question of fitting into a genre and conforming to its conventions or defying them. I think that historically that has had to do with Black people's relationship to literacy in European languages, in settler colonial contexts like the U.S., in diaspora, in the U.S. and the Caribbean and so on, and in colonial situations in the world, that our relationship to the languages that the dominant publishing industries and apparatuses work in has never been the same as where those norms are set. So we've always had a certain challenging and transformative relationship to those conventions. So even the question of genre hasn't come from the exact same place in the cultural backgrounds, the heritage, the context that Black writers are operating out of. But the thing about literacy is that you can learn how to do things. And the way that I think Black writers participating in science fiction and fantasy have taught publishing and have taught entertainment how to do different things, in large part has shown that we can make hay out of, defying genre conventions. That we can say, oh, it's science fiction, it has robots. It's fantasy, it has magic, it has dragons. But we can also turn those things on their heads at times. We can reimagine sort of what historical past a fantasy narrative is told in. We can reimagine what life on other planets looks like based on a different experience with what life on this planet looks like. And all of those really remarkable things Black authors have done, collectively, not to a person, but collectively, have spoken to the fact that that relationship between whiteness and the science fiction genre and its history in concrete terms, in terms of what's been published and who has written what and what names are recognizable, that does not have to be the way it has been in the past, and that it didn't necessarily have to be the way it was in the past before. It's just, if we maintain it that way, we get more of the same. But when we allow it to go out on a limb, and when we say it can be something else, that leads to innovation and creativity. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
So I think, taking something out of that, I would suggest you're suggesting that if we want to look back, historically speaking, at Black contributions to the genre, we might need to redefine what the genre means itself a little bit.
Exactly.
The kind of way we think about science fiction is already white in some capacity, and if we want to include in the kind of canon earlier Black writers, we might need to rethink a little bit about those kind of tropes that are and conventions of the genre, which actually all come from white writers in the first place. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Yeah. That, well, the way I get at it, because I'm an academic, I use more words to get at it than writers who are successful at showing it to be what it is. When I try to tell people what it is, the way I usually say it is that it's not even necessarily that, white folks invented these genres and these spaces, but that they dominated them historically. That to the extent that certain innovations, certain challenges, certain uses of imagery might go against the tendency to uphold a colonial worldview and a white supremacist worldview, even a worldview that will be more familiar to people who are white than other people, or more alienating to people who are not white. To the extent that those characteristics become conventional, that's not a function of who every single individual authoring a certain narrative is. It's more a function of collectively, how markets operate over time, how people in decision-making roles like editors and publishers and also consumers, and all of the different intermediaries, distribution and booksellers and advertising and so on. All of those things work together to give us conventions, and they also work together to give us margins and niches and minor tendencies instead of major mainstream tendencies. And to the extent that Black folks have been on the outs of lots of things, that's evidence of our relative disempowerment in those fields. But it's also, to the extent that it's reproduced over time instead of treated as a problem to be addressed, it's also kind of an engine of continued marginalization, right? So if, for instance, some of the examples I use in Speculative Blackness and some of the examples I use in my writing about comics and in the writing I've done more recently, if we expect stories with Black folks at the center, authored by Black folks, to, let's say, always show up during Black History Month, or always show up as like a very special episode of a Star Trek series that is clearly treating race allegorically, or is clearly taking race seriously and making it concrete, whereas usually it's metaphorical. If we expect that arrangement of what's marginal and what's typical to stay in place, instead of saying, let's just turn it on its head, let's make this whole Star Trek like Star Trek Deep Space Nine, let's have Black folks in it all the time. And let's have experiences with the history of people of African descent on Earth in the narrative repeatedly. Those tendencies show us, oh yeah, we have been looking at this in one way, but from somebody else's point of view, they have been experiencing this in a totally different way. And when we tap into that, we really call into question whether things have to be this way. And we see in practice, they could be totally different. Sometimes they are totally different, and it will cause you to say, am I even looking at the same thing? Am I looking at what I expected? And what is it about my expectations that keeps me kind of locked in to a typical way of seeing? How might we get out of those expectations and embrace other possibilities instead? And those are the times when I find it really valuable to see how different creators and different audience interests have called into question, what is the genre? What makes it what it is?
Yeah, I guess you could come at this and sort of say, well, the stakes are quite low. We're quibbling over over kind of genre definitions, or
Yeah.
you could say the stakes are quite low because science fiction is and fantasy and speculative fiction isn't really a kind of serious gritty genre in some capacity. But actually, I think you do a really good job in your introduction to the Black Fantastic of kind of setting out why this is important. And you write particularly elegantly, I think, that quoting here, seeing other people's dreams take flight while your own are tethered to the ground is dispiriting. Everybody wants to experiment, to test the rules, to find out for themselves, but Black people don't get to discover and grow under anti-Black conditions. And, I just thought, if speculative fiction is considered this kind of white space, what does, I suppose the implication is, what does that mean for the ability of Black people to imagine and collectively own visions of the future? Does that kind of show that there are real, proper stakes, well, there are proper conditions at stake here?
Yeah, the conditions under which, creative storytelling take place are something I'm preoccupied with more so than like the criteria or the definitions of, the results of creative practice, right? And that's a way of saying, yes, the categories of analysis we bring to fiction and entertainment and media can be really useful, and they can be really critically interesting, and they can cause us to think differently and to find things we might not have found otherwise if we adjust how we deploy those categories. But the definitions, the categories, the boundaries are never as important to me as the conditions that give rise to them. And when people are more free to be literate, when people are more free to live out possibilities that they've envisioned, and when they're more free to say or to try out what they've imagined, we get cool stories of things that are true, and we get cool stories people can tell about what they're afraid of happening or what they would like to see happen. And all of that goes back to the conditions that we live in and the conditions under which people create. And it has a lot less to do with whether we've properly named those experiments and those visions.
I think that, you've obviously spoken a little bit about this project and already, but I wondered whether there was something with, working with great authors in quite close proximity that you really took away from the process, or particularly learned putting the collection together.
Oh, one thing I learned was that it was something of a challenge for this publisher to put out an anthology with all living writers because, Library of America, lots of America in literature and in our libraries is authors who have been dead for some time, right? So Library of America has put out a fantastic collected edition of Ursula Le Guin's fiction recently, a couple of volumes, I think, of Butler's writing, but I know at least one that is beautiful and wonderful. And Butler is fairly recent compared to, a writer from 100 or 200 years ago. But when putting something on the shelf and saying, this is not just the next person's library, but this is like the Library of America, not even to be grandiose about it, there's a difference between working with and teaching works by living writers and working with and teaching literature that, lived in a certain moment that we are no longer in. Something that was wonderful was that these 20 writers said yes, and that's great. But something else that's really amazing that I found important was that a lot of these things were published in different formats, in different venues originally. So some of them were published only online and not in print. Some of them were published the first time they appeared for the public were in audio format because people listen to podcasts, people go to different spaces in social media and online, and they're not just reading stories that are published as if you've just put a magazine on the internet, but they're engaging with media differently. And so to put in print something that people might have encountered before in audio format being read to them is a really cool thing to do. And to me, just as fascinating as, having available a story that people have read in print and encountering it in audio, maybe in a way that suits your consumer habits, your commute, your day-to-day life, your learning style differently. So that opportunity to engage with different formats in the process of putting this stuff in print under one cover was really, I think, really unique.
And I think this kind of leads into a question about what project you're working on at the moment, because we were talking before the interview started about what you've been writing, and very much it seems to come from out of that. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I am finishing a book called Audio Futurism about radio adaptations of Black speculative texts. And it is a little bit of a bricolage. It's a little bit of an account of radio plays based on Black writers' works that I found, not discovered, but found and pulled together to write about critically. But it's also kind of a thought experiment played out in book form that asks a question that's somewhat similar to what I asked in my first book, which is basically, what happens when you place Blackness at the center of a phenomenon within the history of science fiction and fantasy. That phenomenon is radio drama. So people know the War of the Worlds exists. People know, or at least they should know, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy existed as a radio play before and as long as it was in print. And these really cool touchstones, Doctor Who has had a long history in radio. So many, probably the Superman radio serial was the, hit, super entertaining. If it were TV, it would have been must see, must listen entertainment when it was on. But these kind of staple narratives, these fixtures in popular media in the US and in the UK to an extent, they've had a long history and a long working relationship with science fiction and fantasy, and they've been one of the places where science fiction has played out, other than in print, for a lot of its history and for a lot of people. But like in other venues, like in comics, like in film, like in television, and like in print fiction, the work of Black authors and the interests of Black audiences have not been central to those institutions and that tradition. So by writing about several of them together, several of them in sequence, several moments when Black authors' work has been adapted for radio drama, I've really tried to see, what does the Black imagination look like or sound like in this format? What does Black storytelling in speculative modes sound like? And how might we place that in conversation with a history, a tradition of radio drama, an aspect of science fiction and fantasy, and also a set of questions about the relationship between Blackness and sound that we might otherwise take for granted, that we might otherwise not learn from in the ways that we could.
It sounds fascinating. More stuff that I just know absolutely nothing about, but I'm certain like this podcast has been a journey of adding to my to be read list extensively. But this is going to be adding to my to be listened to list, I'm sure. So that's great. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Andre, and it's been great. And thanks also for acknowledging the time difference here, for being an early enough riser to come and speak to me before my dinner time. As a sign off, we ask our guests to tell our audience about a text, could be a novel, movie, piece of criticism, comic book, whatever you want to bring to our attention. Your own books excluded. That's a given that people should read the Black Fantastic and Black Speculative Fiction. Yeah, have you got sort of books that you would recommend that you think maybe, and if I could ask you for two, maybe someone just starting out with Black speculative fiction, or someone who some of our listeners I expect who maybe just got stuck at Delaney and Butler and maybe want the next thing to go on to, perhaps.
Yeah. I want to throw out like a couple of recommendations that might lead people in other directions. I guess anyone who, not even if you're stuck, but if you're excited, if you're motivated by knowing about Samuel Delaney or Octavia Butler or Nalo Hopkinson or N.K. Jemisin, whose names are very deservedly very recognizable right now. You should also know the work of African futurist writer Nnedi Okorafor, who has published a number of award-winning novels for adult readers and young adult readers that draw so extensively and sometimes syncretically, sometimes in ways that like synthesize and remix and critically revisit different African and African diasporic cultures in science fiction and fantasy settings. And teaching her newest novel, Death of the Author, in class right now, and it's proving really fun, in part because it's new and it's current, and because it speaks to uh, a way that people inhabit and experience Blackness in the world today, which is quite different from in, say, the 60s and 70s and 80s when Delaney and Butler were starting their careers, which is to say, there are many, many millions more African immigrants to the United States in the 21st century than there were in the 20th century. So our whole landscape, our whole set of cultural references and who we're in proximity to has shifted. And Nnedi Okorafor's writing very much comes out of the world that we live in now, the world in which African authors inhabit the world differently and have futuristic and fantastical stories to tell that were not being told before. Another direction I would point people in is so I read a lot of comics. I have written a little bit about comics published by Milestone Media in the 1990s. And some people who read DC Comics might see some of their titles out on the market again today. I want to draw people's attention to, if they can find them, pick up a collected trade paperback of those Milestone Media titles from before, so that you have a little bit of an insight. You have a secret code word to see what is newly emerging on the market, and you can see how it was done, before you might think it was done in like 1993 and 1995. In comics, I also want to highlight that so much of what's new in comics happens through new ways. So in the comics that I write about, they were in print rather than online. They were for a direct market to specialty retailers rather than maybe like directly to your door or in a digital format. So there's a collection called Long Distance, an African comics anthology that was published the way a lot of comics are published today, through crowdfunding. And that one, I think the company is called Etan Comics, Etan. And that collection, Long Distance, is one of many really cool African comics collections that can be in the world, like literally all over the world today, through these newer platforms that we have available.
And they are easy to get hold of then.
I thought so. It seemed, because it was easy enough for me, I thought it was pretty easy. But people have pretty good online searching and connection skills, and I think they will track them down.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andre. That's been really informative. Really loved having you on the show, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a great evening, and this has been wonderful.
Thank you to Andre for coming on to the podcast. I found his thoughts on race, speculative genres, the tension between criticism and fandom, literary modes, emerging publishing avenues, and how all of these topics interact with each other to be hugely interesting. And I hope you, as listeners, did too. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please let us know. You can rate and follow the podcast, leave a comment on this episode, or you can send us an email using the address in the podcast description. We've got some great interviews lined up, so please join us for those, where we will be exploring some more utopian and dystopian fictions.